Picture this. You're invited to dinner with Queen Elizabeth I, one of history's most powerful monarchs. You're expecting elegance, refinement, maybe some witty conversation about defeating the Spanish Armada. Instead, you're hit with breath so putrid that foreign ambassadors literally complained they couldn't understand her speech, and a smile that had the acoustics of a broken piano. Welcome to the surprisingly grim world of royal hygiene, where crowns came with more than just political power. They came with some truly horrifying personal habits. Before we dive into this aromatic journey through history's most questionable bathroom habits, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy learning about the fascinating, often disgusting realities behind the fairy tale. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's brave enough to join us for tonight's particularly pungent historical adventure. Now dim the lights, maybe light a scented candle, trust me, you'll want it. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what we're about to explore will forever change how you think about those glamorous period dramas and their impossibly clean, sweet-smelling heroines. You'd think queens draped in silks and sipping from jewel-encrusted goblets would have a standing date with a marble bathtub and a lavender-scented loofah. But no. In the grand tradition of historical irony, royal women were often some of the least bathed people in Europe, and it wasn't due to a lack of resources, it was completely intentional. You see, back then, bathing wasn't just unnecessary, it was downright dangerous. According to the finest court physicians, the same brilliant minds who believed hysteria was caused by a wandering uterus, hot water opened your pores and invited disease in like an unwelcome houseguest. Pores were basically tiny drawbridges, and bathing lowered them all at once. Plague demon also invited to the party. So what was the solution? Simple: don't bathe, ever. Queen Isabella of Castile famously declared she only bathed twice in her entire life. Once when she was born and once when she got married. After that, her body was a closed system, a nation-conquering, soap-deflecting ecosystem of legend. Think about that for a moment. This woman conquered kingdoms while smelling like a medieval barn that had given up on itself. When queens did brave a bath, it required logistics that would humble a military campaign. First, servants had to fire up about 40 buckets of water. Then they had to pray they didn't scald their royal employer's backside or leave her soaking in lukewarm disappointment. Most tubs were leaky wooden barrels. Less spa day, more bobbing for parasites in an oversized pickle jar. The alternative? The wipe and hope method. Linen cloths rubbed against unwashed skin to remove what they politely called surface sin. No water, no soap, no dignity. Just friction, denial, and the occasional prayer to whatever saint protected against body odor. And when I say perfume, I mean industrial quantities of floral oil, powdered ambergris, and anything vaguely plant-like that could mask the aroma of unwashed nobility. It wasn't subtle. A courtier once wrote that approaching Queen Catherine de' Medici was like being punched by roses. Some gowns had herbs sewn directly into the fabric, turning royal women into walking casseroles of time and despair. Others reeked of violet water and what historians diplomatically call defeat. But here's the thing. To the medieval nose, that was glamour. Royal women didn't just wear perfume, they weaponized it. The goal wasn't to smell good. It was to smell stronger than whatever ecosystem was thriving underneath those layers of silk and denial. They weren't dabbing it behind their ears like modern perfume users. Oh no, they were practically bathing in it, spraying it into their towering wigs, rubbing it into their gloves, and in some cases infusing their furniture with it. If you sat on a duchess's chair, you'd walk away smelling like wilted violets and mild ammonia. A true courtly souvenir that followed you home. Perfume was also political. A well-scented royal woman projected wealth, grace, and above all, distance from the unwashed masses. If you could mask a 4-day sweat with top notes of jasmine and base notes of what was literally whale vomit. Yes, ambergris is exactly that. You clearly had both power and access to some very questionable beauty product. Queen Marie Antoinette had an entire personal perfumer whose only job was developing custom fragrances for every mood and occasion. Morning perfume, afternoon perfume, I'm about to be beheaded perfume. All distinct, all floral, all desperately attempting to gaslight everyone into thinking she didn't smell like 12 layers of velvet soaked in panic sweat. Royal women wore some of the most extravagant clothing in history. Velvet, silk, brocade, fur, layered skirts that could double as emergency shelter, and bodices tight enough to cause spontaneous religious experiences. But here's the shocking truth. These dresses were almost never washed. Laundry, to the average royal lady, was something whispered about in servant quarters. A dark, mysterious ritual involving water, fire, and possibly witchcraft. The reality was that most royal garments were far too expensive, delicate, and elaborately constructed to risk being scrubbed, soaked, or even slightly dampened. Instead, dresses were aired out. That's right. Hung near a window for a few hours and declared fresh. If a court gown had hosted a week of banquets, a christening, and someone's unfortunate digestive emergency, no problem. Just drape it near a breeze and hope the perfume kicked in before the bacteria organized a revolt. And we're not talking about just the outer layer. These were full outfits with multiple components: chemises, petticoats, stays, corsets, gowns, trains, all of which absorbed a rotating mixture of sweat, body oils, food spills, and what historians delicately term powdered wig fallout. If those dresses could talk, they would beg to be burned as an act of mercy. Even more charmingly, dresses were often shared. Not among equals, that would be peasantry, but among ladies in waiting and younger nobles. Hand-me-down in royal terms meant inheriting someone else's dried sweat and perfume, crusted into taffeta like a very expensive, very aromatic archaeological layer. To maintain appearances, many queens owned dozens, even hundreds of gowns, not so they could rotate them for hygiene purposes, but so no one would see them in the same outfit twice. It was about fashion, not freshness. Cleanliness was optional. Being seen as poor was unthinkable. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European royal courts had collectively decided that growing your own hair was for peasants and monks. Instead, wigs became the height of fashion. The bigger, whiter, and more structurally ambitious, the better. For royal women, this wasn't just about hiding gray strands or thinning hair. It was about declaring social superiority through the medium of detachable head furniture. Some of these wigs stood over a foot tall, powdered to ghostly pallor using flour or starch, then decorated with bows, feathers, artificial flowers, and in extreme cases miniature ships, complete with working sails. Yes, there were women walking around with naval battles happening on their heads, and you thought your hair mousse was excessive. Here's the unwashed truth. These wigs were rarely, if ever, cleaned. You couldn't just shampoo and go. These architectural marvels were glued, sewn, or pinned into place. And the idea of dismantling them regularly was about as appealing as voluntary plague exposure. Instead, the wigs were simply dusted with more powder and left to marinate in their own filth. This created 5-star accommodations for head lice. The warm base, organic powder, and general lack of disturbance made these towering hairstyles basically luxury hotels for parasites with tiny luggage. Queens and duchesses weren't oblivious to this. They just had tools. Enter the louse stick, a long, thin, bejeweled rod used to gracefully scratch one's scalp in public while pretending to be deep in philosophical thought. Because nothing says divine right to rule quite like discreetly excavating insects from your head during a diplomatic dinner. If that sounds grim, it gets worse. Rodents sometimes joined the party. Mice were drawn to the powdered wigs, possibly mistaking them for oversized pastries or prime real estate. There are documented cases of noble ladies waking up to discover their hairpiece had been gnawed overnight by entrepreneurial rodents looking for a cozy nest. This led to the invention of wig cages, small wire enclosures placed around the head while sleeping. Picture trying to get a good night's rest while wearing what essentially amounted to a medieval bird cage on your skull, all to prevent mice from setting up housekeeping in your hair. Every royal court had its symbols of power: crowns, scepters, thrones, and for many noble women a long fancy stick specifically designed for extracting lice from their powdered scalps. These weren't your average garden variety twigs. They were called louse sticks, elegant ivory or gold-plated tools with dainty handles and disturbingly specific utility. Wielded like a royal wand, they allowed queens and countesses to casually excavate their heads in public while maintaining perfect posture and pretending absolutely nothing was wrong. Of course, everything was very wrong. When your towering wig is basically a baguette with feathers, filled with starch and delusions of grandeur, you're going to attract visitors. And when those visitors start hosting dinner parties on your scalp, you can't just scream and slap your head like a commoner. Court etiquette extended to parasite removal. There were actual rules about proper lice scratching technique. Too aggressive and you looked unrefined. Too delicate, and you risked missing your target entirely. The ideal approach was a slow, almost contemplative motion, as if you were pondering the fate of the kingdom rather than trying to spear an insect behind your ear. Some louse sticks were so ornamental they resembled hairpins or jewelry. Others had tiny compartments for scented oils, allowing you to dab perfume onto your scalp while performing pest control. That's medieval multitasking at its finest. Simultaneous grooming and warfare against your own scalp ecosystem. There were even court rumors about who scratched the most and who pretended not to. Out of sheer pride, a duchess might rather endure the itching than admit she'd been colonized by insects. Because in a world where your hairstyle weighed more than a small child, vanity knew absolutely no limits. What do you get when you mix vinegar, white lead, and societal pressure to look like a porcelain doll? The 18th century royal skincare routine, a deadly combination of vanity and chemistry that would make modern toxicologists weep. Royal women were obsessed with achieving what they called the porcelain look, pale, smooth, and glowing with the luminescence of someone who hadn't seen sunlight or criticism in decades. The ideal complexion wasn't just about beauty, it signaled wealth, nobility, and the fact that you didn't have to work outdoors or acknowledge the existence of peasants. Unfortunately, Mother Nature rarely handed out naturally flawless moon-pale skin, so royal women turned to home chemistry, and by home I mean medieval weapons laboratory. The most infamous product was called Venetian ceruse, a paste made from white lead and vinegar. Applied generously to the face, neck, and chest, it provided a flawless finish while slowly destroying everything underneath. Skin peeled, sores developed, hair fell out. But for a brief, glimmering moment they looked stunning in candlelight. Side effects were dismissed as delicate constitution or sensitivity. Never mind that many women developed lead poisoning, lost their teeth, or ended up looking like melting candles. The important thing was appearing ethereal while doing it. Makeup wasn't applied subtly either. This wasn't the no makeup look. This was layer until your pores surrender. Thick white base, bright red cheeks made from mercury-based rouge, and beauty marks, sometimes strategically placed to cover festering sores caused by yesterday's beauty marks. Let's talk about those beauty marks, fashionably called moches, made of velvet, silk, or mouse fur. Yes, actual mouse fur, because apparently they weren't done with rodents yet. These little patches were glued strategically around the face. One near the mouth meant flirtatious, near the eye meant passionate, on the chin meant available for political marriage negotiation. Eventually, skin damage became so severe that women applied even more ceruse to cover it, creating a delightful cycle of decay and denial that would continue until either death or bankruptcy intervened. Despite the palaces, pearls, and powdered faces, the dental health of royal women was a medieval horror show with jewelry on top. Sugar had arrived in Europe and was quickly embraced by the nobility, not as an occasional treat, but as a lifestyle choice. Royal women, eager to display their refined taste and perhaps drown their sorrows in marzipan, consumed sugar like it was an essential vitamin. The result, teeth that staged full-scale revolt. Rot, abscesses, and blackened molars were common. But instead of developing what we now call dental hygiene, which hadn't been invented and would have been considered suspiciously clean anyway, royal ladies simply stopped using their teeth. Meals were mashed, stewed, or liquefied. If you couldn't eat it with a spoon or sip it through a grimace, it wasn't worth the pain. Queen Elizabeth I of England, famous for her dazzling court and terrifying political intelligence, reportedly had such decayed teeth in her later years that foreign diplomats complained they couldn't understand her speech. When your smile has the acoustics of a broken harpsichord, international diplomacy becomes an interpretive dance. To hide the damage, women kept their mouths mostly closed in portraits and public appearances. Smiling with teeth was considered crude anyway. That was for tavern wenches and children. A royal woman's best accessory was mystery, and if that mystery smelled faintly of clove oil and tooth decay, well, such was the price of refinement. To combat the rot without actually brushing, which would have been revolutionary, some royal women rinsed with honey wine, chewed herbs, or stuck whole cloves in their mouths like aromatic splinters. Others used early tooth powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, and cinnamon, which shockingly did not reverse cavities but did provide a pleasant grinding sensation. If a tooth absolutely had to be removed, it was done without anesthetic by the local barber, because apparently cutting hair and extracting molars were considered neighboring skill sets in the medieval professional directory. You might assume that royal women wore elaborate undergarments beneath their silks and velvets, corsets, petticoats, maybe something resembling what we'd recognize as underwear. You would of course be delightfully wrong. For much of history, royal women wore absolutely nothing under all those layers. Yes, beneath the brocade, the lace, and the 12-pound beaded gown, it was often just a breeze and a prayer. The concept of underpants, even in their most primitive form, was considered either too masculine or too peasant-like. Breeches were for men, undershorts were for field workers. A noble woman was expected to be so elevated, so ethereal, that her lower half presumably existed only in theory. Many women did wear a linen shift or chemise, a basic smock that served as a washable barrier between their skin and all the unwashed finery. But under that, no drawers, no knickers, just the draft of divine right, and perhaps a hint of rose water if they were feeling fancy. This created numerous royal inconveniences, especially when nature called. Imagine trying to delicately hover over a chamber pot while balancing 30 pounds of gown, corset, panniers, and zero elastic support. The process required a lady's maid, excellent thigh strength, and possibly divine intervention. Enter the bourdaloue, a small gravy boat-shaped urinal designed for noble women to use discreetly under their skirts during long carriage rides or tedious court ceremonies. Because nothing says diplomatic grace quite like discreetly relieving yourself in porcelain while discussing trade agreements. Even when underpants did start appearing in aristocratic wardrobes in the late 18th century, they were often viewed as suspiciously French, scandalously practical, or simply unnecessary for a woman of proper breeding. Modesty had its limits, especially when weighed against 14 layers of embroidered silk and ceremonial duty. But somewhere between the embroidered corsets and fur-lined gowns, many royal women discovered an unadvertised feature of luxury clothing: violent allergic reactions. The materials that screamed nobility also whispered itchy death trap. Silk was treated with mercury, arsenic, or toxic dyes to achieve those luscious blues and blood-rich crimsons. Lace came stiffened with wax or lead-based starch. Fur looked magnificent until it started molting inside your sleeves mid-banquet, triggering sneezes, rashes, and the occasional existential crisis about whether beauty was worth breathing difficulties. But none of this mattered to the royal fashion industry. The goal wasn't comfort, it was silhouette, symbolism, and whether the Pope would faint from how expensive you looked. Corsets were the crown jewels of medieval wardrobe torture, made from whalebone, wood, and occasionally straight-up metal. These rigid marvels compressed the torso into fashionable submission while cutting into skin, triggering eczema, and making deep breathing a nostalgic memory. Then there was the jewelry. Royal women draped themselves in pearls, rubies, and gold-plated copper. Copper, as it turns out, can turn your skin green, but that was acceptable as long as it matched your dress and demonstrated your ability to afford metals that slowly poisoned you. The layers were the real challenge. Winter or summer, you were wrapped in 6 petticoats and counting. No ventilation, no moisture-wicking fabric, just you. Half a dozen underskirts and the distant sound of your skin breaking out in rebellion. Some outfits were literally sewn onto the body, so if you started swelling or reacting mid-ceremony, your options were limited to smiling through the burning or developing a reputation for being delicate. Fashion was always worth the suffering. After all, peasants worried about practical things like warmth and comfort. Royalty worried about whether their murderous blouse made them look fat. Cleanliness was treated like fashionable fruit or stable politics. You didn't pursue it regularly. You did it strategically, and preferably when it wouldn't kill you. Bathing in winter? Absolutely not. That was basically sending an engraved invitation to pneumonia to waltz in and end your dynasty. The prevailing medical wisdom stated that warm water opened your pores, and open pores were basically tiny doorways for disease, demons, and disappointing marriage proposals. So during colder months, most royal women opted to layer their filth rather than remove it. Instead of soap and water, they turned to perfume, powders, and an almost supernatural level of confidence. A spritz of rose oil here, a puff of violet powder there, and voila! You've disguised 3 weeks of armpit accumulation with something vaguely floral and deeply misleading. Summer wasn't much better. Bathing was more acceptable, sure, but still rare and laborious. On particularly hot days, a royal lady might dab her face with rose water-soaked cloths or freshen up by changing her linen shift. The 16th century equivalent of spraying deodorant over yesterday's questionable decisions. Hair washing followed the same seasonal rhythm, with actual washing off the table for most of the year. Royal women resorted to dry shampoo in its earliest and most questionable form, powdered starch, mixed with perfume and hope. They'd cake it into their scalps until the oil was absorbed, or more realistically, until the powder turned gray and flaked onto their furniture like dandruff snow. Even tooth care was seasonal. Mint leaves, vinegar rinses, and tooth powders made from ground oyster shells were used more frequently in summer, when bad breath had a shorter fuse in the heat. In winter, let it stew. No one would dare comment on a queen's halitosis when she was already dying of cold and political pressure. Ultimately, hygiene was less about actual cleanliness and more about managing perceptions. If you looked composed and smelled vaguely like a spice merchant's estate sale, you were winning the game. The dirt, the odor, the occasional parasitic roommate, that was all just part of the royal ecosystem. By the end of a royal woman's hygiene cycle, and we use cycle very generously here, what you had was a person draped in gold lace, and at least 3 layers of floral panic. When you couldn't clean yourself and bathing was a once-a-season flirtation with death, you did the next best thing. You weaponized perfume. Perfume wasn't a luxury. It was a defensive strategy, much like powdered wigs or inherited titles. It served to hide uncomfortable truths beneath a layer of expensive denial. Every royal woman had her signature scent, but not in the romantic "this reminds me of spring flowers" way. This was survival perfume. This was I haven't bathed since Christmas, but I still need to host foreign ambassadors perfume. Scents came in oils, tinctures, pomanders, and scented gloves. Rose water, lavender, ambergris, violet, clove, and sometimes musk, which was literally scraped from deer glands that probably regretted their contribution to royal beauty routines. The goal wasn't to smell good. The goal was to smell like money, mystery, and power. When things got especially dire, enter the vinaigrette necklace, a tiny fashionable container holding a sponge soaked in vinegar or perfume. Women would clutch it discreetly and inhale, pretending they weren't drowning in their own atmospheric soup of accumulated essence. In crowded courts, this layering of scents created a chemical fog of passive-aggressive elegance. You'd walk into a ballroom and immediately get hit with 15 different flavors of floral terrorism and exactly zero evidence that anyone owned soap. The perfumes were so strong that some guests fainted from the olfactory assault. Others just adjusted their expectations of nobility to include burnt nostrils and political nausea. Because power didn't need to be clean. It just needed to be presentable. A queen might smell like a medieval compost heap beneath her satin, but if her perfume was strong enough and imported enough, people would bow anyway. Let's talk about something historians often whisper about: menstruation, the thing nobody wanted to discuss, especially if you were a royal woman expected to be ethereal, divine, and eternally unstained by the messy realities of human biology. Unfortunately, biology didn't care about court etiquette. Once a month, the ladies of the court faced a very human problem beneath their elaborate gowns: managing their periods with absolutely no modern conveniences, and a disturbing lack of privacy. Tampons? Nope. Pads? Not exactly. Modern menstrual products didn't exist, and even the concept of sanitary was more of a vague aspiration than a lifestyle choice. What noble women used instead were rags, cloth, strips, natural sponges, and a lot of prayer. The most common method involved tying softened linen rags to a belt worn under the dress, essentially strapping a napkin to your body and hoping physics would cooperate. If the linen shifted or the belt loosened, congratulations, you just become the Duchess who literally stained the throne. In public, everything had to appear serene and bloodless. If a royal lady felt cramps or dizziness, she was described as delicate, moody, or simply unwell. Court language that could mean anything from PMS to political poisoning. Privacy was limited. A lady-in-waiting was always nearby, ready to assist with dress lifting, fabric adjustments, and quiet crisis management. There were no private bathrooms, just chamber pots behind decorative screens, and the terrifying knowledge that someone probably heard everything. And here's the real twist: menstruation was political. A missed period meant whispers about pregnancy, legitimacy, and succession. A period that came too frequently was labeled unnatural. Bleeding was never just bleeding. It was gossip fuel, family drama, and court intrigue all rolled into one monthly biological function. Queen Anne of England suffered through 17 pregnancies, many ending in miscarriage or stillbirth, and every drop of blood she shed was interpreted like a prophetic omen, because heaven forbid a woman just have a functioning uterus without it becoming a national political event. When we picture royal women, we imagine pristine gowns fluttering in palace breezes, silk gleaming in sunlight, everything smelling faintly of lavender and aristocratic smugness. The truth, their clothes were rarely washed, and when they were, it was done with the enthusiasm of someone volunteering for plague duty. Most royal garments weren't just fancy. They were architectural achievements made of silk, velvet, brocade, fur, and enough lace to catch small birds. These outfits couldn't simply be tossed into a wash basin. Water ruined expensive fabrics. Soap faded those precious dyes, and scrubbing wrist structural damage to gowns that cost more than entire villages. So instead of cleaning their clothes, everyone just pretended the problem didn't exist. Dresses were aired out, brushed down, and perfumed into submission. The logic was beautifully simple. If it smelled like roses and clove oil, it must be clean, right? Never mind that sweat, smoke, food stains, and the occasional bodily emergency were trapped inside like ghosts in a brocade prison. Undergarments, usually linen shifts, were technically washable, but even those weren't laundered often. Why? Because laundry was labor-intensive, expensive, and let's be honest, nobody wanted to handle royal armpit rags. Servants assigned to laundry duty had one of the most dreaded positions in the palace hierarchy. The washing process involved dragging garments to the nearest water source, heating enormous cauldrons, scrubbing by hand with harsh soaps made from lye and ash, then wrestling with drying and pressing everything flat with literal slabs of heated iron. It was so exhausting that some households had dedicated laundry quarters, basically medieval misery huts, where servants went to contemplate their life choices while beating clothes with wooden paddles. If something ripped or stained beyond redemption, it was passed down to lower-ranking ladies-in-waiting. Congratulations on your promotion to hand-me-down stench receiver. Some monarchs took this avoidance to majestic extreme. Empress Josephine, wife of Napoleon, reportedly changed gowns several times daily. Not because she washed them, but because she never wore the same filthy dress twice. The discarded gowns piled up somewhere in the palace, probably still radiating their own microclimate of perfume and regret. So there you have it, the surprisingly aromatic truth behind royal glamour. While we've been raised on Disney movies and period dramas featuring impossibly clean princesses with perfect teeth and mysteriously fresh breath, the reality was far more pungent. These women ruled empires, commanded armies, and shaped the course of history, all while harboring ecosystems in their wigs, managing periods with medieval technology, and treating soap like it was a weapon of mass destruction. They proved that power doesn't require cleanliness, just confidence, enough perfume to knock out a small horse, and the ability to convince everyone that your particular brand of aristocratic funk was actually a mark of divine favor. The next time you complain about your morning routine, remember Queen Isabella's 2-bath lifetime policy, or Marie Antoinette's personal perfumer working overtime to mask the scent of unwashed silk and panic. Remember the Duchess scratching lice from her towering wig with a gold-plated stick while negotiating trade deals, or Elizabeth I conducting international diplomacy through teeth so rotten that foreign ambassadors needed interpreters. In the end, perhaps the most royal thing about these women wasn't their crowns, their jewels, or their political power. It was their absolutely breathtaking ability to maintain dignity, authority, and an air of divine superiority while smelling like a medieval barn that had given up on life. They remind us that history is human, messy, and often much stranger than any fairy tale. Because the truth is, even queens put their unwashed, perfume-soaked stockings on one leg at a time, assuming they wore stockings at all, which, as we've learned, was far from guaranteed. Sweet dreams, and perhaps invest in some extra soap. Your ancestors would be proud.